Yes, I am the trade analyst for the FLEGT Independent Market Monitoring Project. For those, probably most of you might not be very familiar with this particular project. It's quite a big project. It's funded by the European Commission, their Director General DevCo. It's managed by the International Tropical Timber Organization. It started back in 2014. It was initially due to run for 5 years, but because of delays with the implementation of licensing systems and issues like COVID, it has been extended now to the end of 2022. The objectives, very clear. They are to independently monitor the market impacts of the FLEGT voluntary partnership agreements, to improve the understanding of the impacts of those agreements on timber prices, trade, and market trends globally, and to contribute to monitoring the impacts of the wider FLEGT action plan, which was set up back in 2003, 2004, I think, to promote the legal trade in forest products. Now, IMM, often a little bit of a misconception. Sometimes we're looked upon as an organization that actually promotes FLEGT licenses. That's not the case. We are interested only in assessing the impacts that they have on the markets, although a big part of what we do is helping to inform market development strategies and raising awareness of the FLEGT program and specifically of the licensing systems. There's a lot of information on our website about what we do, lots of reports, newsletters put up there every quarter or so, and we produce an annual report. The newest one will be published within a couple of weeks on that website. One of the things that we do a lot of is we spend a lot of time trying to increase access to data, good quality data on global timber trade flows. We've been working very closely with the Global Timber Forum, the GTF, on this thing called the Sustainable Timber Information Exchange, which effectively is an online database with all the trade data, all import and export data for 46 reporting countries. That includes the EU 28 plus, EU 27 plus the UK, of course, now, plus another 18 countries, mainly large tropical countries and industrialized countries around the world. And together, that database covers about 90% of global forest products trade. The website is there. Everything is free to access. The system is designed to provide an easy way of downloading the data if anybody's interested in the detailed data. And most importantly, what we try and do is make sure that the data is available as soon as it's published by the countries concerned. So it is updated monthly. So at present, we've got data running until I think at the latest, it's to August this year. So if you're interested in the data, there is a new system to access it. It's very easy to get hold of, but I won't bore you any more with that. I'll move straight on to, well, actually, I will tell you briefly about the dashboard that IMM has on our database, on our website. This actually summarizes the data from STIX, which is relevant to the mandate of the FLEGT IMM. And that's specifically statistics on the global and EU trade with the 15 VPA partner countries. But again, there's the URL for that particular dashboard. You can access the data very readily on there. Moving on to the presentation structure. What I want to do is give you initially an overview of the tropical timber trade globally. And fortuitously, today was actually the day that the ITTO released preliminary results of their so-called biennial review of the tropical timber situation. If you're not aware of this, this is something that they'll publish every 2 years. They've just updated their data, trying to take into account the impacts of COVID this year. And in fact, today they were due to release the presentation slides, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes, on the global timber situation as they've assessed it as things stand at the moment. I'll also move on to talk about the immediate impact of COVID-19 on the tropical wood imports into the UK, into the EU 27, the United States, and into China. And then I want to just provide a brief update on the status of the FLEGT voluntary partnership agreements and their role in the international tropical wood trade. And then finally, just comment a bit on some of the feedback we've received from IMM surveys on the market impacts of FLEGT licensing in the EU. Okay, let's start with the International Tropical Timber Organization's biennial review of the tropical timber situation. As I mentioned, very current data. These are preliminary results presented today. In fact, they were meant to be presented today. I think they've been slightly delayed and will be presented tomorrow morning, actually. So you're seeing them even before the International Tropical Timber Council. The slides and the presentation, it wasn't put together by me. It was put together by the ITTO statistician, by Jean-Christophe Claudon. I looked at his slides and I thought, my word, they're a lot better than the ones I put together for this presentation. So as a result, I'm using his slides, his presentation for a lot of my comments today. Just some background, this review is based on a compilation of trade flow data from the Sustainable Timber Information Exchange and other sources, but also it's linked very much with data that the ITTO compile from this thing called the Joint Forest Sector Questionnaire, which they send out every couple of years to all the forestry departments around the world, with a view to these forestry departments returning the data and, in theory, providing an accurate and thorough assessment of production and trade in all these forest products. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that. A lot of the governments are very slow in returning the data. A lot of them don't return the data at all. There are a lot of gaps, and you'll actually see from some of the slides that I show you that the production data is actually extremely poor and often doesn't change from year to year. But we make do with what there is, and it provides a snapshot of where things are likely to be. I'll point out some of the problems, the discrepancies where they exist as I go through the presentation. Now, the full report that for which this data has been prepared, it won't actually be released for another 6 months or so. So you're seeing very much the early stage results. As I mentioned, a lot of the data, there are a lot of data gaps. I just think this slide summarizes it pretty effectively. Quite a few of the countries do not report at all to this particular biennial review and to the wider forest products questionnaire. Often there's more data on the consumer side. That's the large industrialized countries. They have more capacity to compile these sort of statistics. Compared with on the producer side, the tropical countries often do not report very regularly to these surveys. They simply do not have the data availability. So one of the problems, if you've been involved in any sort of analysis of tropical timber trade and flows over the years, you find that the data, particularly on production in tropical countries, is extremely poor and often does not change from year to year. But anyway, moving on, one of the things that was obviously a priority this year in this biennial review was to assess the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the global trade in tropical forest products. And this slide summarizes the changes in primary wood products trade flows, both globally in all global flows and also specifically looking at tropical flows. And I think the main takeaway from this slide is that, yes, there's some very significant declines in trade this year, and particularly on the tropical side. If you look across the product groups, the decline in tropical log volume is 20%, compared with total decline in all logs is 12 to 15%. We're looking at the volume of sawnwood, that's down 21% in the tropical trade, compared with down around 10% in the total global trade. And tropical plywood in volume terms was down 12%, compared with 10% of global trade. If we're looking in terms of actual value, the primary wood products trade globally has probably lost in the order of 10.5 billion US dollars this year. It's down about 14% compared with last year, whereas the total tropical trade in primary wood products probably down about 17%. Has lost about 2.5 billion in value as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. These figures do not show more value-added products like furniture, which is quite interesting. Incidentally, the decline in the value of more added value products like joinery and furniture products has been significantly less, and it really does confirm what we've known for some time, that there tends to be a lot more volatility in the primary wood products trade than there is in the added value trade, which again is emphasizes again the value and benefits of tropical countries moving up the value chain and producing more value-added products. This shows the long-term trend over the last 30 years in world imports of tropical primary wood products. Some rather interesting trends are immediately apparent from this. The log trade, of course, was very large back 30 years ago, dominated by Japan. But that volume declined pretty rapidly between 1990 and in the 1990s, continued downwards and reached a bottom point in the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Since then, there was a bit of a recovery during the period 2009 through to 2014. This was driven very much by one country, by China. There's a bit of a spike here in imports of tropical wood products, of tropical logs, sorry, in 2014. This was due to a boom in rosewood, which was supplied to China, particularly into the furniture sector there. There was a point in 2014 when a cubic meter of rosewood was selling for tens of thousands of dollars in the into China. Highly speculative trade flow at that time. That particular bubble in trade burst in 2015, and since then the general trade in log trade has been downwards from about 2015 down to 2020 to a level this year, which is estimated to be about $17.5 million this year globally. So that decline in log trade, that really set in well before the COVID impacts became apparent, but it has strengthened considerably this year. If we look at tropical sawnwood, this is the brown line here in the middle. It's been much more stable over the long term. There was again a dip, obviously, during the financial crisis, and then a recovery driven partly by China, but also by the United States and Japan and various other countries. The EU during this period was a relatively flat market for tropical sawnwood. So during that, and Southeast Asian countries, particularly Vietnam as well, was also becoming more important in the imports of sawnwood during that particular period. And again, a decline in tropical sawnwood imports set in back in 2017, 2018. This was primarily because of weakening in the Chinese market. And again, there's been quite a sharp dip this year in 2020. Looking at plywood, different profile again. It's basically fallen from, it's been a step change during the financial crisis from levels of about 12.5 million cubic meters per year before the financial crisis to a level of about around half that since 2009. It's been pretty flat over the last decade. There was a bit of an uptick in 2017, 2018, driven initially by the United States and then by Japan, also to some extent by the UK, importing more from China with a tropical hardwood face. And again, there's been a dip this year, of course, due to the COVID situation. Now, this is the production data that ITTO have compiled so far. And again, it looks like it's been fairly flat over the last 10 years or so. But this data hides a whole load of inconsistencies, problems, but also some very, very significant underlying changes in the sources of logs and in the types of logs which are present in trade. You can see some of the problems with the data just by looking at these flat lines. This is data that hasn't changed for a period of about 8 years or so for Indonesia, although there is actually quite accurate data on Indonesia these days, although it's not being reproduced in this particular report. India, the data never changes. It just stays static at about 50 million cubic meters a year. And then there's this step change in Vietnam production of logs. Now, what the big changes that are underlying this is that, firstly, a lot of the logs previously at the start of this period, quite a lot of wood was coming from conversion forest lands, particularly in Indonesia, some of it driven by illegal conversion. That situation has stabilized to some extent. There's less wood coming from conversion forests, particularly in countries like Indonesia, and there's been a shift in Indonesia particularly, but also in Vietnam and to some extent in Malaysia, certainly in Thailand and places. Big shift towards production from plantation resources rather than from natural forests. So a large proportion, particularly in Asia, less so in Africa, a large proportion of the production is plantation nowadays. And in fact, it's one of the interesting things about this chart is it doesn't actually identify any individual African country, which in global terms their production is much lower in terms of fiber volume, much lower than in Southeast Asia, where there is this huge increase in production from faster growing plantations. Now, this is one of the charts that ITTA was put together on trade flows, trying to visualize those trade flows. This one focuses very much on tropical logs in 2019, and the immediate impression you get is a very accurate impression is that the tropical log market is driven almost entirely by China. China is a hugely dominant market for tropical hardwood logs in international trade. India used to be a larger market in the days when it was buying lots of logs from Myanmar, lots of teak logs, but that trade has now dwindled to tiny volumes. It's actually illegal now to export teak logs from Myanmar, and actually the availability of the logs from that country has declined dramatically. But China is mainly importing logs from Papua New Guinea, one of the largest supplying countries, followed by Solomon Islands, which is a lot of its plantation resource. We're looking at that huge volume from the Solomon Islands with a lot of interest because compared with the size of the resource there, this volume is being exported from the Solomon Islands for some considerable length of time. And it must get to a point when that resource it becomes exhausted, but it's still continuing for now. The other logs are coming, a lot of them are coming from East Africa now, from Mozambique. A few years ago, there was a lot higher volume from East Africa that was driven by the rosewood trade. That volume seems to have declined to some extent after the end of the speculative boom in rosewood. And then there's a few log export flows coming from Central Africa, from the Republic of Congo, Cameroon, and Equatorial Guinea. There's this interesting trade flow in logs, which always makes me sit up and look when it says Brazil to China, and you're thinking, why? Because Brazil actually banned log exports from natural forest many decades ago, but only recently exports of logs from Brazil have begun to occur, and these are teak logs from plantations, which in Brazil are now just entering the global market in significant volumes. Again, Europe over here, of course, does not feature at all in the global tropical log markets nowadays. There used to be quite a flow, particularly from Gabon into France to feed the plywood sector there, but Gabon has, of course, banned the export of logs in recent years, and the plywood manufacturing sector of tropical plywood in Europe is much smaller than it was in previous years. This is just showing the major exporters, looking at the time trend. Again, not a lot to add, but to this, there is, yes, here's Brazil, which is a new flow. This is teak logs. It's going not only to China, incidentally, but also to some extent into India. Papua New Guinea is now the largest single exporter of tropical logs into the global trade. Malaysia was, at the beginning of this decade, was by some significant margin, the largest exporter of logs, these primarily being logs from Sarawak into China and into India. But that volume has now much reduced, much tighter control on log exports and on log harvesting in Sarawak than there was previously. Solomon Islands here, it is just beginning to narrow in terms of supply. The leading African exporters now, Cameroon and the Republic of Congo, the two largest, although again, slightly declining in volume in recent years. This is the major importers. I don't think we need to dwell too much on this. It's pretty obvious. China accounts for a very large share of imports of tropical logs. In fact, a generally rising share of a decreasing trade overall in tropical logs, but in last year or this year, it's projected to account for about 8 million cubic meters of a total of around 13 million cubic meters. So a very, very large share. Other importers, India, Vietnam is taking a reasonable amount of logs now, particularly from Cameroon in Africa. And Indonesia is identified as a major log importer, but in fact, that's primarily pulpwood and smaller dimension stuff from Malaysia going into the paper industry. Yeah, that just summarizes the monthly imports of tropical logs this year, just highlighting the impacts of COVID, particularly large fall in log imports into China in January this year, at the time of the particularly bad pandemic situation in China earlier on in the year, although it's consistently every month except July being below the previous year's level. Moving on to look at tropical sawnwood. Again, not a lot of very good quality data on production levels of tropical sawnwood in a lot of countries. This data doesn't change very often. Vietnam, India, Thailand, a little bit of a change, a bit of a rise. What more can we say about this data, really? The Malaysian data tends to be more accurate. It's been fairly stable production there for some time, but generally narrowing. China, of course, is quite a large producer of sawn lumber from tropical logs. But generally, the impression is it seems overall the volumes are quite stable. However, having said that, as with logs, we're talking about a completely different profile for the species types, for the quality, the price levels of the sawnwood in trade. Back in the 10 years ago, there was a lot more of the higher value commercial species from natural forests and trade. Nowadays, there is a lot more of the volume is sort of lower value, often from plantations, particularly for countries like Thailand. A lot of this is actually low quality, relatively low quality rubber wood, and it's all going to China from Thailand. Here's the major trade flows in tropical sawnwood. Yeah, that's the trade flow between Thailand and China, very much emphasized there. This again is, as I say, principally rubber wood, perhaps some acacia, lower end plantation species. Again, another thing, the EU individually, if we're looking at individual controls, bilateral flows between countries, EU flows into the EU from Africa do not feature strongly on that. The only one that is highlighted here is Cameroon to Belgium. If the EU was treated as a whole, it would account for a much larger flow of about 1 million cubic meters a year of tropical hardwood goes into goes into the EU, not only from Africa, but from all tropical regions. Again, sawnwood though, China is very much at the heart of the tropical sawnwood trade. Most of the flows there. In fact, China is showing a greater appetite for sawnwood than it did previously, partly because of rising costs of production in China itself, and also, of course, because of a lot of log export bans in many parts of the world now, so they can only import products as sawnwood, whereas previously they would have imported it as logs. Brazil features here, all with the major flow obviously into the United States. A lot of decking products, of course, going from Brazil into the United States. Here we go. This is just showing again the time trend, looking at tropical sawnwood exports, the major exporting countries. Again, it just highlights the large amount of fiber coming out of Thailand, lower value plantation species, the narrowing in exports from Malaysia, previously the largest exporter at the beginning of this decade of sawnwood, tropical sawnwood. That export has been narrowing consistently for about the last 3 or 4 years, as Malaysia now is much more focused on producing domestically higher value furniture products and that sort of thing. This is on the import side. Again, China features quite strongly here. Well, it's very dominant in the global market for tropical sawn timber in volume terms. Again, if the EU 28 is treated as a whole, it accounts for about 1 million cubic meters per year. And then we've got Vietnam as the third largest region of import, followed by the United States. Yep, and here this highlights again how the global trade in tropical sawnwood has been declining. Obviously, very steep decline this year with the COVID crisis. But again, this is a trend. It's simply reinforcing a longer-term trend, which has been particularly driven by this decline in imports into China as the economy, in partly because of the end of the rosewood boom, but also because of the decline in the Chinese economy in 2018 and 2019. When I say decline, what I mean is a slowdown of growth there. It's obviously continued to grow, but at a much slower pace than in previous years. This is the data for production of tropical plywood globally by the major countries. This data is particularly poor. A lot of it doesn't change from year in, year out. In fact, very little accurate data on how much tropical plywood is being produced. In China, I'm sure it has not been flat like that, because we know for a fact that due to changes in environmental regulations in China, quite a lot of mills did close in China during the period of 2017, 2018 period. There was quite a lot of consolidation in the Chinese plywood production sector at that time, and certainly the EU, the buyers in the plywood sector are much more focused on a more limited range of larger suppliers in China than they were previously. Indonesia, the production there has been actually fairly consistent as far as I'm aware, when I look more closely at Indonesian data. But India, again, I have no idea how much plywood has been produced in India these days. It simply is impossible to get any reasonably accurate data on that. Malaysia, though, yes, there does seem, again, you can tend to rely more on the Malaysian data. It does seem to have been a progressive decline in production volumes from Malaysia, and that's also reflected in trade flow data, which shows quite a significant and long-term fall in Malaysian exports of plywood. And Vietnam is just emerging now as a more significant exporter of plywood into the global market. Much of this, of course, destined for the United States. And these are the major trade flows in 2019 for tropical plywood. We've got here, just to highlight a few things, we've got the major producers. Indonesia, still a very, very large and dominant player in the global market for tropical hardwood plywood, with still this very large traditional flow. This has been a large flow for many years. Indonesia into Japan, a large and generally rising flow for a while, Indonesia into the United States, Vietnam emerging as a more significant player. That's nearly all going into the United States. And Malaysia, the decreasing volume that is available, more of that, a greater share of that is going into Japan. Again, what's interesting is of these big suppliers in Southeast Asia, the European market is not identified as one of their major trade flows on this chart. The biggest trade flow of tropical hardwood plywood into the EU now actually doesn't even come from the tropics directly. It's re-export, or its products manufactured in China and exported particularly into the UK. And then again, the time series trends, again, just highlighting how the market has changed. Malaysia generally narrowing, Indonesia continuing to rise until 2018, slowing a bit in 2019 and 2020 with the decline, particularly in demand in Japan, and to some extent into the US, I think, in 2019. Vietnam just rising strongly, and China, fairly volatile volumes, to some extent reflecting changes in production capacity and in the direction of trade there. Major importers, yep, the USA is on the bottom here. It was actually, the imports were continuing to rise in 2018 and 2019, tropical hardwood plywood. Japan generally narrowing, buying less and less tropical hardwood plywood, although the volumes are still significant. There's been quite a significant shift over the years towards alternative panel products and softwood plywood in Japan. Same to some extent in Republic of Korea. And here's the EU 28 imports of tropical plywood gradually narrowing in 2019 and in 2020. Much of this, as I said, is actually from China coming into the UK, and Malaysia here, a bit of an upsurge in 2019, but a narrowing this year. Now, just briefly talk about SPWP, and this is in the ITTO terminology. These are secondary processed wood products, which basically is wood furniture, joinery products, anything which is not a primary product, which is more added value. In the tropical trade, of course, there's been a big policy focus on driving the trade more towards secondary processed wood products as a means of increasing employment, increasing the returns from the tropical trade in these countries. A policy which has had mixed results, it has to be said. In Southeast Asia, it certainly has been a major factor of trade. Less so in Africa, where a large proportion of the products are, in fact, to some extent, a larger proportion than they were 20 years ago, are destined for China and consist of more primary wood products. But certainly, the secondary processed wood products trade has been certainly was increasing rapidly until 2019, before the COVID crisis. But it was driven by a fairly limited range of countries, particularly Vietnam here. And again, another point to emphasize about these products, although they're exported from ITTO producer countries, tropical countries, there is actually a lot of non-tropical timber in the mix. For example, with Vietnam, we are looking at a lot of more interior wood furniture products, joinery products, which are manufactured increasingly actually from non-tropical woods, from American hardwoods particularly. And a lot of the exports from Vietnam particularly are going to one particular country, to the United States. And in fact, exports of wood products generally from Vietnam have been rising at a rate of about 1 billion per year for much of the last decade, a huge great increase. And much of this is furniture products. And in fact, in 2018, 2019, the growth of this trade was boosted very much by the trade dispute between the US and China, which of course encouraged more trade to shift into via Vietnam into the United States. And again, this is showing, actually, this is not showing all secondary processed wood products. It's showing trade flows for wooden furniture from China and from the major tropical producers, the ITTO members in Southeast Asia. And again, it's highlighting that the United States is by far the largest individual market. The United States furniture sector about 15 years ago did move out pretty much wholesale from the United States into initially into China, more recently into Vietnam, and the investment flows are becoming more, have grown also into Malaysia and to some extent into Indonesia in recent years. So those are the dominant flows. The one or two flow, India is just beginning to emerge as a more significant exporter of wood furniture. It marks the USA here, but it's also been quite a lot of growth into the EU from India, particularly products made out of mango wood, craft products, some of it quite high quality now, being exported into the United States and into the EU. China is still, of course, very dominant in this particular market, although its competitiveness has been somewhat impaired in recent years, not only by the US-China trade dispute, but by rising labor rates and costs of production in China, whereas Vietnam has been continuing to expand. That then summarizes the global changes in trade flows from the biennial review. I'll just move on to the next stage of the presentation, which is going to look a little bit more closely at some of the immediate impacts of COVID on trade flows this year, looking at considering some of the prospects for the future. Certainly, the economic and financial impact has been extraordinarily dramatic and, of course, very varied according to the different regions. If we look here, we've got the changing GDP growth according to ITTO's regions, the consumer regions, primarily in Asia. This is primarily China, but also includes Korea and Japan. But this region overall obviously saw quite a significant dip in the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, but generally has been growing much more rapidly than other parts of the world. And also the economic dip in the COVID crisis this year has been much less than elsewhere, and a very significant rebound this year is forecast. In fact, I think by the end of next year, China, the economy of China is forecast to be about 10% bigger than it was last year, whereas the economy of all the other major economies around the world will be no bigger than they were last year by the end of next year, and might even be significantly smaller. So China is going to become a more dominant economically as a direct result of COVID. I think there's absolutely no doubt of that, given the strength of the shallowness of the downturn and the strength of the rebound in China. If we're looking elsewhere, this brown dotted line here, this is the EU 28, which has always over this period been underperforming elsewhere, rather slow growth, subdued growth. It dipped further than other economies during the financial crisis and has seen by far the biggest dip in economic growth amongst consumer regions as a result of the COVID crisis. This year, the economy of the EU 28 is going to be down about 8% compared with last year. Quite a reasonable bounce is expected next year, but it's got a lot of ground to make up, and that will be a very short-term bounce. And the expectation is that the growth will then descend back to the sort of more moderate levels of 1 or 2% that's characterized the EU region for some time now. The United States outperforming the EU over the long term, and less of a decline this year than the EU, lesser of a bounce next year, but again, it does look like the economy there is behaving more robustly than the EU economy, although there's a lot of uncertainties at present in the United States situation. Looking at the producer regions, we can see that Africa was growing quite rapidly during the period to about 2014. It slowed then. Obviously, had a lot of ground to make up the African economies. There's a lot of population growth, of course, in Africa as well. So this was driving quite a large amount of growth in parts of Africa during that period. And the downturn has been, again, very dramatic, but there will be quite a good bounce this year. This is according to the International Monetary Fund, I should emphasize. Asia, again, was growing strongly in the period before COVID, a very, very sharp decline. This is principally in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and Malaysia and Indonesia. They have seen a dramatic fall in economic growth this year. And then Latin America, yes, has had significant economic problems over the last 5 years or so. Big economies like Brazil has really has a very weak economy for the last five years or so, and has seen one of the most dramatic falls in economic growth as a result of the COVID crisis. So what we can really say overall is that a very significant impact on the relative share of the global economy as a result of COVID, which will obviously have long-term implications for the trade in tropical forest products. Now, just moving on, I'm going to focus in briefly now on various regions, starting with the EU tropical wood trade. What's been happening in the EU over the last 3 or 4 years, and what has been the impact of COVID. Well, in 2018 and 2019, as this slide shows, there was actually quite good growth in EU tropical wood products imports. This is looking at all products, all wood products, and also including wood furniture products. The value of those imports did increase last year by about 1% to 4.4 billion US dollars, and that followed an even bigger growth in 2018, a 6% growth in EU imports of these products from tropical countries. And in fact, if we're looking across all those product groups, tropical share in total EU imports increased slightly from about 22% in 2018 to 23% in 2019. So a little bit of an upturn. However, I should emphasize that that follows quite a large decline between the end of the financial crisis and about 2013, when the tropical imports share in EU markets fell from about 35% down to about 21 or 2%. So that although we've seen a little bit of a rise recently, it's still pretty much flatlining over the long term. The drive, to a large extent, the increase in share was driven by Indonesia, which from the perspective of the organization that I work for, the Independent Market Monitor, that's particularly interesting because this stuff is FLEGT licensed. And the fact that some of the largest gains were made by Indonesia last year may have some significant policy implications from a FLEGT perspective, some positive implications, in fact. Imports from other VPA implementing countries, of which there are 5 in Africa, imports from those countries into the EU increased overall by about 3% last year. And there was quite a lot of growth in imports from Vietnam, 4% growth to nearly $1 billion US dollars last year. So Vietnam is becoming a very significant supplier of tropical wood products, if we include furniture, into the EU. EU imports of tropical products from Brazil also rose quite significantly, both in 2018 and 2019, particularly driven by currency effects. The Brazilian currency has been extremely weak during a period of weak economic growth in Brazil. A lot of focus there on developing export markets in Brazil. And there has been some shift in Brazilian supply as well. They are developing large concessions in Brazil. They've been talking about it for some time. They seem to be making some progress with that nowadays. Although I think a lot of the production still does come from smaller operators in the Amazonia region. Now, this is looking at the short-term trends, again, looking at how the EU 27 and UK total imports of tropical wood and wood furniture have changed over the last 5 years on a monthly basis. It's just to highlight what has happened this year compared with previous years. And this red line here shows the monthly trend in 2020. And what's immediately obvious was this very sharp drop in May in EU 27 plus UK imports. In fact, during that month, I think they were down about a third against the 5-year average for that particular month. But then there was actually quite a significant recovery in June and July. We're still waiting for EU-wide August data, but the overall, the impression we have from this is that the downturn was rather less than initially feared, at least in the short term. There was quite a bounce, and by the end of August this year, total imports of tropical wood products into the EU were 2.58 billion for that 8-month period. That's about 18% less than the same period in 2019. And in fact, overall, this level of import is the same as it was about 5 years ago in 2015, 2016, before there was this bit of an uptick in overall EU imports of tropical wood products. People listening in probably know more about why there's been this bounce than I do. Certainly, the impression you get is that the DIY sector, the garden furniture sector, was relatively buoyant, more buoyant perhaps than expected during the lockdown, as a lot of people took the opportunity to do a lot of work on their own homes. There has been, certainly in the UK, probably in the rest of Europe, there has been quite a revival in house building and in the housing market generally since the lockdown. I think lots of people have looked at their homes and decided they want something different or something bigger or something with a bigger garden, and that has stimulated the market for houses. And certainly they've also received quite a boost from a very strong fiscal stimulus. The stamp duty holiday in the UK, for example, there's been quite a lot of focus on getting the construction sector moving again. And this certainly seems to have played well in the short term. But of course, what the implications of all that will be for the long-term future of the tropical hardwood market and the wider wood products market in the EU as the support measures are gradually withdrawn and there is this big debt burden that we will all have to deal with. And just looking at sawn hardwood imports, this is looking at the long-term trend in EU sawn hardwood imports in 2004 to 2019. Just to briefly introduce the comment on sawn hardwood trade before we look at the 2020 data. We can see here how the overall trade is pretty much split between tropical countries and temperate countries. I think it's about 50-50 and has been for some time. About 1 million cubic meters of tropical sawn wood imported into the EU every year, and about 1 million tropical cubic meters of temperate hardwood species. Cameroon is the largest supplier into the EU, followed now by Brazil, which, as I say, has been picking up, and Malaysia is the third largest. On the temperate hardwood side, of course, sorry, did you miss all that? And a big rise in imports from the Ukraine and Russia. Moving on, this is showing how the EU imports of tropical sawn wood have changed in 2020. Again, this was started the year quite slowly. So actually this trend is rather unusual. The effects of COVID are not immediately obvious. There was a bit of a downturn in February, well before the lockdown measures, and then actually it was rising in March. So there's no immediate sign there, COVID signal in the trade data. Looking at the first 8 months of the year, a bit of a downturn from Cameroon, from Brazil, although it's still higher than it was 2 years ago, and Gabon, but not significant downturns. Malaysia has been weaker this year into the EU generally. And this is looking at EU tropical sawnwood imports, same data for particularly for the UK, where there has been, and there certainly was, a much more significant downturn specifically in the UK imports of tropical sawnwood in May, which continued into June, but there was a very encouraging bounce in July, which was almost continued into August. This is generally obviously a very slow month for imports into the UK, but it was better than it was in 2016 in August this year. So again, obviously a major effect, but there was quite an encouraging bounce. We're looking overall, Brazil, imports from Brazil have continued to rise this year. Cameroon, down a bit, but still more than they were 2 years ago. And the Congo Republic is where there has been one of the biggest declines. And of course, Malaysia, again, quite a large decline in imports from there this year. Plywood imports is looking pretty at plywood imports into the EU. Well, the year started very slowly, a lot of problems in the plywood trade in Europe at the end of last year. And in fact, the volumes were actually recovering fairly continuously, even during the lockdown period, and reached a peak in June. Surprising trade trends there, seemingly rather unaffected by the COVID pandemic during this period, which is, as I say, quite surprising. Overall, though, in the 8-month period, yeah, imports are down from Indonesia, they are down from China. Although, of course, this is building on a very weak trade at the start of the year, and it's debatable whether without the pandemic these trade flows would have been much better, because there was a lot of overstocking in the European plywood sector in the second half of last year, and a very strong import early in the year and weakness late in the year. This is the UK again. We're looking at a fairly, although it's obviously volatile on a monthly basis, trade flows have been fairly consistent during the period. No sign of a significant upward or downward trend on the long term. It is a weak year overall compared with previous years, particularly last year, where there was this very large import of tropical hardwood plywood from China, a rather short-term spike in imports, particularly during the middle of last year. So this year it is well down from China. So now just moving away from the EU and talking more about what's happening elsewhere in the world. What are the prospects elsewhere in the world? China, I've already mentioned a couple of times. Certainly the Chinese economy, it slowed in 2019, and this certainly led to a significant decline in tropical log and sawnwood imports. But China has got to grips with the pandemic relatively early on. And as I mentioned earlier, it is expected to be the only one of the few, or in fact only, large economy to grow this year. And the economic growth this year is expected to be about 2%. Imports from Solomon Islands, Cameroon and Thailand are already recovering quite well and have been recovering since the start of the second quarter, although imports from Papua New Guinea, Mozambique, Laos, Equatorial Guinea, Vietnam, India, Indonesia are much reduced this year compared to previous years. And that's partly due to obviously problems on the supply side as well as on the demand side. One of the big things that certainly FLEGT Independent Market Monitor is looking at closely is the possible effects of this new forest law in China, particularly the Article 65, which introduces a prohibition on imports of and trade in illegally harvested timber products. On the surface, it looks something a little bit like the requirement established in the Lacey Act, but of course, at this stage, there's no detail on what the regulatory requirements for if any regulatory requirements will be required for due diligence and that sort of thing. At this stage, it's uncertain what the impact of that new prohibition will be on trade with China. It could be significant, or in practice, it might mean very little. We shall see. This is looking at the United States, prospects for tropical wood products trade in the United States. This chart here actually shows I think very clearly what the prospects do not seem to have been damaged too much at all. This is actually showing monthly imports into a rolling average figure to give long-term trends. It's showing a very continuous trend pretty much in imports from Vietnam. This year, it took a bit of a dip during the COVID pandemic period, the lockdown period, the initial lockdown period anyway, but it did recover pretty quickly and is showing the long-term trend has been barely affected. So lots of imports still coming in from Vietnam. So a very short and sharp decline followed by a strong rebound. In fact, only India, where there have been significant supply side problems, has been slow to recover its exports of furniture products, particularly into the United States. But as I emphasized before, prospects in the US are very uncertain with the pandemic. We've had just the US elections with the results only announced recently, what that will mean for US-China trade relations and also trade relations with Vietnam, because the US has introduced a trade representative investigation into Vietnam trade, essentially alleging that there's been large-scale imports of illegal wood into Vietnam, and that this is leading to unfair trade practices. The irony is, of course, that Vietnam, just at this very moment, is introducing a new law itself to ensure that illegal products are removed from imports. So it will be interesting to see how that particular investigation is resolved, particularly with a new administration in the United States. I can talk now about the current status of the FLEGT. I should ask the chairman briefly, though, if you want me to move on to do this, or do you think, would you want to move on to the next session? I've given an overview of the tropical trade.
I think it would be good to just give a quick overview just on the status of VPAs, and then we'll move on. Thank you, Rupert.
Okay. So, yes, just to talk briefly about the FLEGT voluntary partnership agreements. As I said earlier, there are 15 countries engaged in that process. These have all signed agreements with the EU, and my understanding is that they're also a lot of these agreements are also being they are all being written also into UK law. So the UK will still also have agreements with these various countries. The Indonesia, of course, was the first to get FLEGT licensing, has been doing so since November 2016. Vietnam is the only country in Asia which is currently implementing a FLEGT licensing system under the terms of a VPA. There are 5 VPA implementing countries in Africa: Cameroon, Central African Republic, Republic of Congo, Ghana, and Liberia. The VPAs they have been initialed, by which it means that the negotiations have finished in Honduras and Guyana. In fact, they finished some time ago, and they are just now awaiting a ratification by the Honduras and Guyana governments. Negotiations are still technically ongoing in Malaysia, Laos, Thailand, Ivory Coast, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Gabon. Although in some of those countries, including Malaysia, including Gabon, there's been very little progress, or in fact, the negotiations have been suspended for some time towards actually implementing a VPA. Together, these 15 VPA partner countries, they are very important overall in international tropical timber trade. They do account collectively for 80% of that trade. There's some recent developments in the FLEGT VPA process. I won't talk much about Ghana because I think Chris Miko will be talking more about that later on. I will just say that they do seem to still be very much in line to be the second country to implement FLEGT licensing, although there have been some delays as a result, obviously, inevitably due to the COVID-19 pandemic this year. The Republic of Congo has been progressing very well towards implementation of a FLEGT licensing system. a lot of interest, a lot of political engagement in that process in that country, driven mainly by forest revenue implications, the fact that licensing can be a very effective system of improving tax take in the country. The Congo has already implemented sustainable forest management plans on 60% of the concession area there. They introduced a new forest law, partly as a result of the VPA process in April 2020, with a big focus on enhanced stakeholder participation in the country and to increase value-added production in the country. Cameroon, completely different picture there. Unfortunately, very slow progress towards any form of licensing system in that country. Although they did last year draw up a new roadmap for 2020 to 2026 period that was prepared last year, just to identify a few areas where there could be some quick gains, some benefits to both parties in a relatively short period of time, but not progressing, as far as I'm aware, rapidly towards any form of licensing in the near future. Ivory Coast, currently a negotiating country, and they have got a new roadmap with a deadline for signing a VPA in 2022. And then after that, of course, there will be a process, a time period required to implement the VPA in the country. How long that will be, we do not know at this stage. Vietnam, yes, we're taking a lot of interest in this because of its huge importance, both as an exporter of tropical forest products and also as an importer of those products from other parts of the world. They are, again, progressing very rapidly towards implementing a TLAS, a Timber Legality Assurance System. They passed a law in January 2019 establishing the legal basis for that system. They've elaborated that in a draft VN TLAS decree. In fact, I think that was passed actually only a few weeks ago. So this is a process which is very much live, very much happening quite quickly. There is a very ambitious national voluntary partnership agreement implementation plan, which was issued in November, and that is being elaborated at agency and regional level this year. Although again, Vietnam has been very badly affected by the COVID crisis, and it's not entirely clear how much that will impact on the timing of the final implementation of FLEGT licensing. Malaysia, yep, it's a very critically important country, of course, still in the tropical wood sector, but formal VPA negotiations in that country have been on hold since 2015. Although Malaysia has, of course, implemented its own national TLAS systems outside the VPA process. These aren't eligible for FLEGT licensing, but they have had a system in place in Malaysia since 2013, Sabah since 2016, and I think Sarawak is due to implement its system this year. Now, just briefly, I'll just show a couple of slides just highlighting the role of the VPA process in international trade. What I really want to emphasize on this from this slide is it shows global trade value in tropical wood and wood furniture by VPA status in the 5 years up to 2019, with a projection for 2020. And the key take-home message from this chart is that FLEGT licensing and implementing countries, they accounted for 48% of tropical trade in 2018. And this year, it looks like they will account for 56% in 2020. And that's ignoring all the negotiating countries. That is only the countries which are technically moving towards licensing and implementing implementing a licensing system. So already they account for a very large share of global trade in tropical wood products. Vietnam has been the major driver in terms of volume. Indonesia, again, we take a lot of interest in IMM in Indonesian trade, because we're obviously looking very closely at how the licensing system is affecting imports and affecting trade with Indonesia. And Indonesia's exports overall, they were rising in 2018. There was a bit of a slippage in 2019. That was due to the slowdown in the plywood and decking market last year. And actually, Indonesia is beginning to export more furniture and joinery. In fact, these are becoming an increasingly important part of their export mix. This highlights the sort of data we're looking at very closely for the independent market monitor, the effects of licensing on trade flows. We get some insight by looking at how trade flows trends have changed since licensing occurred. Again, the key issue here was that there was actually a bit of a decline in imports of quite a few commodities immediately after licensing was implemented, although there was a bit of an uptake already in plywood and decking and moldings. No, sorry, in certain furniture products. But anyway, it was a slow burn, and it took a while for the trade to begin to respond to this licensing process. There are a lot of other factors, of course, driving these trends, but we're confident that licensing had some impact on some of these trade flow trends, particularly the rising imports of furniture and joinery products, and certainly also plywood and moldings for a period until the middle of 2019. Since then, things have changed a bit. The plywood trade and the decking trade has been declining since the middle of last year for a range of other commercial factors. But last year, there was a very significant increase in furniture imports from Indonesia, particularly if we look over here, a lot of that trade was driven by the Netherlands. The UK actually has seen did see a more gradual increase in imports from Indonesia until the end of last year, although the problems with the plywood and molding sector since then have seen quite a significant slowdown. And of course, COVID factors coming to play from around the second quarter of this year. So this is just very briefly summarized. We've done loads of surveys and trade consultations right across the EU, asking a lot of detailed questions on the impact of the licensing system on their trade flows, on how much it's affecting the markets for different tropical wood products. And this is probably obviously a very obvious conclusion to anybody involved in the trade, although actually this is still lost on a lot of policymakers. I think sometimes we seem to think that as soon as a license is issued or a certificate is issued, that's going to completely transform the market for a product. Of course, markets never work like that and never will do. So FLEGT licensing is not the determining factor. It's an important factor, but it's not the determining factor in market share, and it's not able to override other competitiveness issues. Price, quality, logistics, etc. Are, of course, critically important in driving market share. And FLEGT licensing, although important, cannot transform markets on its own. However, our surveys do show that FLEGT licensing makes importing from Indonesia a lot easier, certainly compared with imports from a lot of other tropical countries, and suppliers in other tropical countries often struggle to demonstrate negligible risk for EUTR conformance. There are a lot of costs associated with getting those assurances from countries in certain parts of the world, and certainly Indonesia has got an easier ride with that in that respect. The rising Indonesia-EU trade in 2018 and 2019 is suggestive of market benefits of FLEGT licensing, and we've always asked this question whenever we've had a trade consultation. We've always asked importers at these meetings, trying to identify which strategies are likely to be most effective in transforming and at least rebuilding market share for tropical wood in the EU. And consistently throughout all the consultations, the answer has always come back that the combination of FLEGT licensing with EUTR implementation is the best strategy ultimately to rebuild tropical wood share in this market. Although also these surveys consistently emphasize the importance of consistent EUTR enforcement and continuing efforts to extend FLEGT licensing to a wide range of countries. There's also a huge emphasis in all these consultations on the need for communication, and not just general communication, not just about policy measures, but very clear business to business based communication campaigns, which are data driven, which will vary depending on different VPA countries, depending on which products they're selling into, which markets they're selling into, and they have to be adjusted very much to reflect those differences in markets and products. There's a clear need for consistent messaging with a focus on the very positive narrative that lies behind the FLEGT process, emphasizing particularly the links to the development of sustainable forest management programs nationally in those countries, and of course the carbon message. And finally, just one last message comes from this slide, the requirements for legality verification in global trade. This slide shows that previous slide, but it's focusing on the due diligence requirements and legality requirements in major importing countries and breaks down the trade by these requirements. And if we look at the global trade, 67% of tropical wood products imports around the world are into what we call regulated markets. And those are markets which have some sort of legislation to remove illegal wood from trade. That's up from 62% in 2018. That currently excludes China, despite this amendment to the introduction of Article 65 of the Forest Law, which we're not including as a regulated market at this stage until we have a clearer idea of what the regulations mean there. And of course, a lot of the crisis recovery packages from COVID, they do involve the introduction of green growth measures. In fact, the OECD estimates that these growth measures in crisis recovery packages currently amount to about $312 billion worldwide. Money which is being focused on developing the circular economy, energy efficiency, low carbon, ecosystem restoration, health and well-being. So the key underlying message here is that there are many new opportunities for wood products where there is a credible demonstration of legal and sustainable supply, but most importantly, and this is something which is sometimes lacking, not in the UK, I may add, but in other parts of the world, it needs to be supported by effective communication strategies. And I think
Rupert,
for more than enough time. Thank you.
Rupert, can we leave it on this
yes,
slide
absolutely,
here?
Yes.
Just while we take in there. Thank you very much for that. It's a very comprehensive overview of global trade, taking in a lot of different areas. We had a few questions come up, and I just wanted to leave this up for people to take some of these things in, because I think it will be very useful for some of the subsequent debates that we have later on in the event. Some of the questions that have come in, the figures that you've put up, are they just for verified legal products, or is that total product coming out of tropical areas?
No, I mean, that's total product. I mean, the only ones where, obviously when we're talking about Indonesia, we're talking specifically about FLEGT licensed products, but elsewhere, yes, we don't have, we're not separating legally verified from the stuff that's not verified.
No, that's what we thought. Just there were a couple of other things, and I'll open up just in case if anybody else wants to type in any questions from the trade data that you've seen Rupert present. Just on one of the things which I did find actually quite surprising during the COVID time, you said the imports were down roughly about 18% to the EU from tropical areas, during 2020. Now, when we look at softwood imports to the UK, they are down about 18%. So I had made the assumption, although we haven't really analysed the data properly, and we won't be able to until the end of the year, but I had made the assumption that of the different sectors of the timber trade, the tropical supply would be probably hit the hardest, and the more kind of utilitarian goods from the softwood sector for DIY and things would have kind of carried on doing fairly well. But it seems from this that actually the tropical trade has done okay in relative terms compared to the others.
Yes, I mean that is Absolutely. I mean, we haven't got to the end of the year yet. There have obviously been enormous dislocation in a lot of tropical countries, but certainly, yeah, the immediate impact seemed to be significantly less than I personally was expecting. It might have, in some cases, it was partly due to timing. I mean, that 18% includes wood furniture, actually. And already a lot of the wood furniture imported from Vietnam, for example, it tended to arrive earlier in the year. It already arrived, or it was already on the water when the major impacts affect. So the timing issue is quite important. So I think we really do have to wait until the end of the year before we get a full feel for the immediate impacts. And then next year, well, that's another matter. We have to see what happens next year. But generally, yes, it was less significant than I first thought it would be.
Okay, no, thanks. Just a couple of other points that I think we may pick up later as well. One of them was about plywood, and just looking at the figures that you presented there was a drop in the export of plywood from China, and then it looked like an almost identical volume of pickup in volume of plywood from Vietnam. Do you think that is a straightforward shift from China to Vietnam?
Yes, I mean, if we look at the global data, yes, to some extent. I mean, in fact, this is one of the things that the US authorities are investigating, this concern that actually there was some of the imports of plywood into Vietnam from China, which has been rising as well. Maybe it simply went into Vietnam and then out again to the United States because of the trade conflict. So yes, that's perhaps one of the issues. But yes, there is a direct shift in investment. Of course, I know Chinese companies have themselves been investing in Vietnam, is my understanding, because of the rising costs and the tighter and controls on environmental regulations and things. China, there has been a shift to Vietnam of certain processing capacity. Yes, I think that's undoubtedly true. Yes.
Okay. No, it's taking on more importance, I think, in the UK market. We hadn't really seen any product at all from Vietnam in plywood terms before, and now it is beginning to come through. And then just on the shift away from natural forest towards plantations, is that a trend you think is going to continue in all tropical countries?
Yes, but obviously at varying rates. Some countries are much better adapted for plantation growth than others. And certainly, I mean, there has been some speculation that, of course, plantations will completely take over from production from natural tropical forest. But again, my understanding is that in parts of Central Africa, for example, plantations do not perform as well as elsewhere. And actually, there's a strong case for continuing to harvest and utilize high quality natural forest hardwoods in Central Africa and other parts of the tropics, and in Amazonia, where you can get a reasonable return from sustainable management. The problems are, of course, that there's inadequate investment. That industry is still seen as a relatively high risk industry worldwide. So we're not seeing any large scale Western investment now in the new investment at any rate. And those Western companies that previously invested there has been some disinvestment over the years. Chinese operators are, of course, becoming more significant in Africa over the years. So that a big shift. The range of tropical hardwood species from natural forest is not as great as it was. Certainly, the volumes are not as great as they were. But I think we can hopefully look forward to a period where there will be a long-term supply of good quality natural forest hardwoods from well-managed sustainably managed natural forests, supplemented by plantation species in those countries which have a good environment for development of plantations.